CEW, Center for German and European Studies. And it is in their honor and the honor of our guests, our Austrian guests, that we have what I deduced from the name of the cafe is Austrian food. I don't know, but then Farid told me that apparently they don't actually have sandwiches in Austria, so I'm not sure how the provenance, or he might also be wrong, to be completely honest. We don't know who's telling the truth here. So the good news is the food is supposedly really tasty, so eat as much of it as you want. Dr. Farid Hafez is a researcher at the Department of Political Science at the University of Salzburg, where Mozart was from? Mozart was from
Mozart,
Salzburg.
all
Okay.
right, yeah, Mozart.
He earned his PhD in political science from the University of Vienna. He's been teaching at a number of universities in the world. In 2014, he was a visiting scholar at Columbia University, and he's the editor of the German and English language Islamophobia Studies Yearbook. He was awarded the Bruno Kreisky Award for the Political Book of the Year in 2009 for his German anthology Islamophobia in Austria. He's published more than 10 books, 20 articles. 10 books, Farid. How come you never bring any of these as presents?
You know, they're
He
German.
did bring a soccer toy. He brought a cake as a present, so I'll take that. His most recent publications include From Far Right to the Mainstream, Islamophobia, Party Politics in the Media, and an introduction to the history of Islamic political thought. He is editor of upcoming European Islamophobia report and the advisor to the Bridge Initiative, which is housed here at Georgetown University. So he's going to talk today about the Islam law, debating the 2015 Islam law in Austria. And this event is going up until 2. We have until 2 o'clock, at which point there is there's a class in here, more specifically my class. So we have
we can blow that off.
Yeah. We have to clear out. So we have until 2. So we'll make use of the time, and then we have to expeditiously exit.
Okay, so
But
40 minutes.
welcome and enlighten us.
All right. Thank you for having me here. You hear me, yes? Or is it not on?
It might just be for recording, so you have to speak
Okay.
very loud.
Great. Thanks for the nice introduction words. It's not that we don't have any sandwiches in Austria, it's just like we don't have typical Austrian sandwiches,
Oh.
right? So
We have
I know
to
some
verify.
people think that we're still living on the mountains in Austria, in the Alps, and that's why it always makes sense to clarify a bit on that, being an Austrian out of Austria. Well, maybe before speaking about the Islam law in specific, I would just try to clarify kind of the framework in how law of religion plays in Austria, very generally. And it's actually very interesting that, I mean, if you think about what is going on with the Muslim presence back in all of Europe, there are many problems Muslim minorities face. I mean, you have the ban of minarets in Switzerland in 2009. You have different ban of the hijab in Germany, in some counties, the ban of the hijab and the burqa in Belgium and France, and many other issues going on with Muslim minorities all over Europe. And it's very interesting to see that actually Austria is historically very exceptional in this regard. And this has to do with some historical reasons. Back in the days of the Habsburg monarchy, the Austrian-Hungarian monarchy, in 1878, Bosnia and Herzegovina were annexed by the empire, and in 1908 it officially became part of the empire, which led in the year 1912 to the legal recognition of Islam the first time in Western Europe. So since 1912 there is a law for the Muslim community which is called the Islam law, the 1912 Islam law. Generally speaking, this is nothing absurd. It's just different to the church-state relations and other European and also the United States, how they accommodate religion in their political system. So it's not only that the Muslims have a law, but it's like we have currently we're speaking about 16 legally recognized churches and religious societies, and the Islamic Council is just one out of these 16. So there is a law for the Protestant law of 1962. There is a law which just was amended in 2012 for the Jewish community, and there are plenty of laws for religious communities. So this per se is nothing discriminatory. It's just a way of how the state accommodates religion in the public sphere. And generally speaking, in contrast to many of the more harder secularist systems, Austrian is very often characterized as being having an inclusive secularity, which means they, by legally recognizing churches and denominations, they also give them some space. To give you one example, practically speaking, if you go to public school and you're a Jew, a Catholic, a Protestant, or a Muslim, part of your curriculum, it's like 2 hours, 1 to 2 hours a week, you have religious education in the public school, which is financed by the government and organized by the legally recognized church or religious society. So this is just one of many examples how religion is included in the public sphere. Nevertheless, this does not mean that, like if you look at how Islam and Muslims are perceived in the larger society, that there are no frictions at all. I don't have to introduce you to the terminology of Orientalism, just to mention one of the notions which was invented by an anthropologist, André Gingrich. He spoke in regard to Austria about frontier Orientalism. And by frontier Orientalism, he meant that Orientalism is not so much a thing of the intellectuals, but it's very much something which is deeply grounded in folklore culture. So it's about everyday culture. For instance, to give you one example, still in the days when I was in the kindergarten, we used to sing a song called it's in German, K-F-F-E-E, trink nicht so viel Kaffee, sei doch kein Muselmann, der ihn nicht lassen kann, which means C-O-F-F-E-E, don't drink so much coffee, don't be a Muselman, a Muslim, who can't let it be, okay, who's kind of addicted to coffee. By the Ottomans, coffee was introduced in Austrian culture. So this is like it's part and parcel of everyday culture. Even if you look to the flag of the Austrian of Austria, it's the red, white, red. It's there are tales. It's not really historically clear if this is a real story or not, but it's like still. I mean, I learned it in school. It's like when the Austrians were fighting the Ottomans, there was a guy who tried to mobilize his own people in a moment of defeat. So he took the cloth, and part of it was full of blood, and that the only part which was not full of blood was where his belt was. So he took his cloth, and it was red, white, red. So still, what we remind when we see the flag is like the long fight against the Ottoman Empire. So in that way, what Gingrich calls frontier Orientalism is a kind of Orientalist thinking which is deeply embedded in everyday culture. So even if you look to the European value study, for the case of Austria, we have currently, the last time it was conducted in 2009, 32% of the question people were saying, I don't want to have a Muslim as my neighbor. And the number doubled since 1999, when it was only 15%. And in 1991, it was also 15%. So you see, there is an issue about how Muslims are perceived in the larger society. So, very interesting, Islamophobia as a political issue came very late to Austria. And I would even compare it very much to what happened here in the United States, remembering myself of like speaking about Islamophobia as a political issue or the political parties, as part of the political campaigning of a political party. I remember like when George Bush one day after 9/11, when he went to the mosque and said, Islam is a religion of peace. Right? And I think the Republicans only started really using this Islamophobia issue when they came into opposition, when there was the 2008 national election campaign for the presidential elections. And very similar to that, also what happened in Austria was that in 2000 to 2007, you had a far-right political party in power. At that time, it was Jörg Haider, the very famous far-right leader. So because of the far-right being in power, there was actually no use making use of anti-Muslim sentiments, prejudices, and campaigning against Muslims, because they already were where they wanted to be. So it's interesting to see that throughout these years, I just give here two quotes. One of the president of the National Parliament of the Conservatives, who was saying, in 2006, Austria does not know any clash of cultures. Our Muslim citizens are an important part of our society. So very much the elitarian discourse of the political leadership was, we have a shared history. Since the Habsburg times, we all are one. This is our Muslim people. That was the political discourse or the elite until, I would say, 2005, 6, and 7, it started declining. Or another statement by the president of Austria, Austria is connected to Muslim culture in a special way. So what happened from 2005 on is that the far-right political party in power split. Jörg Haider founded a second right-wing party which tried to position itself very much on the liberal scale at the beginning. And the old far-right party with this old history also of going back to National Socialism and before that, started using this Islamophobia in its campaign from 2005 on. I remember like there was one slogan which said in 1994, Vienna should not become Chicago. When he was saying Vienna should not become Chicago, he actually meant a place of multiculturalism, and for the perception of Austrians, a place where black people were drug dealing and doing violence. And 10 years later, in 2005, it was Vienna should not become Istanbul, arguing that the Islamization of Austria is coming with the Muslim immigration. So there was this shift, and this shift was very, very strong. At the beginning, it was very much restricted to the far-right political parties, but years by years, it came into the mainstream, or the centrist parties, the Social Democratic Party and the Conservatives, the Christian Democrats. So to give you just one example, this is from 2008, the so-called Viennese Academic Circle, which was at that time part of the Conservative Party in Vienna. They issued a 15 points program, and they had many of those demands they positioned were actually only about Islam and Muslim people. One of those was they demanded the disclosure of the foundations of Islamic faith as required by the Austrian law of religion, which it is not in fact. And they also demanded a certified translation of the Quran. Why? Because then if a Muslim works in the bureaucracy, he would be able to distance himself from those verses of the Quran which violate constitutional principles. Because in their opinion, this is what is the case. So this actually was a very, very fringe group. And even meanwhile, they are excluded from the Conservative Party out of other reasons, because they were anti-Semitic. But nevertheless, I mean, this Islamophobic issue was part of that group, and it was part, therefore, also of the centrist parties. But still, the politicians, the representatives in parliament, the ministers, they were at that time not making any kind of use of those Islamophobic populism. In 2013, what happened was that the government, consisting of the Conservatives and the Social Democratic Party, in their working plan, which is issued at the beginning of every coalition, was arguing that the Islam law of 1912 should be amended. The text says, the Islam law from 1912 will be actualized and amended. This has to be done along the principles of parity, which means that every church, legally recognized church and religious society, has to be treated in the same way and not discriminated. State neutrality, because the state is not allowed to interfere into religious affairs of a church or religious society. Autonomy and autofinancing. Autofinancing actually was a new term they came up with, which is not known to law of religion in Austria. In order to embed imams in Islamic theology in the linguistic and social context of Austria, these have to be trained on a long term in Austria. The currently existing bachelor program in Islamic theology hence has to be supported furthermore. So this is actually a tendency that you see all over Europe, that you have state universities institutionalizing Islamic theology in order to create what they see as a loyal German Islam, a loyal Belgium Islam, and a loyal Dutch Islam. So if you look into the political system of Austria, one of the most important characteristics is it is a very corporatist system, which means in contrast to the United States, you don't have this kind of lobbyism, but you have a legal incorporation of interest groups by law. So it's like the interest groups of the workers, the interest groups of independent companies, private companies. They are included in the political system, and if a law is issued on anything having to do with labor market, then they are consulted informally before the law is drafted, but also formally by being part of the negotiations. So in regard to the law of religion, what has to be mentioned here is that laws are always prepared together with a church or denomination. Throughout my research, which I've done, I also spoke to the former president of the Jewish community, during whose legislature period the law for the Jewish community was amended, and he was saying, quote, that the law for the Jewish community, the draft, quote, the draft was elaborated in an academic tranquility between the ministry official and the Jewish community, quote, end. And it's very funny to see when the law for the Jewish community was amended, there is normally a time period of 5 to 8 weeks after the drafting of a law, a draft law is presented, that reviews can be submitted to the government. This can be done, normally it is done by those organizations who are kind of attached to this issue, which means in this case churches or religious societies, or other ministries of the government, or just any individual is able to give a review. And it's very interesting to see that when the law for the Jewish community was presented, there were 10 reviews, out of which one was critical from a liberal Jewish community. For the Islam law, there were 160 reviews, out of which 130 were fundamentally critical towards the law. So I think this already shows like how the law was perceived, not only by scholars of law who were very much criticizing the law, but also masses of the Muslim NGO world and individual people who just reacted on that. And it's very interesting to see that the law for the Jewish community it took from the publication of the draft until the law was signed, it took 1.5 years. For the Islam law, it took half a year. So they did not really consider what was criticized during this democratic process. And another very interesting and very important aspect here is that Austria is very famous, especially when it comes to interest groups, and the more it is the case when it comes to churches and religious societies, that there is a political culture of consensus, which means in the history of law of religion, there has never been any law against a church or or a religious society. And the Islam law actually was the very first law where this happened. So, again, another important aspect is, because I said there is something called an Islamic Council, which is the legal recognized Muslim church, so to say. They were actually part of the drafting process on one side, but on the other side they were the ones who were very critical of it when it was published. So this also reveals strong internal frictions in the way the law was perceived by the official Muslim Council itself. So to give you a very short overview of what happened, on the 2nd of October, the draft law was presented to the public, and until the November 7th, there was this review process. On the 3rd of December, there was a meeting of the Council of Ministers, who sent it then to the National Parliament. On the 13th of December, there was a call for the President of the Islamic Council to step back because of the huge criticism. And in January, what happened is that you had, in January and in February, you had meetings of Constitutional Affairs Committee to review the law in terms of, is it anti-constitutional or not. I was actually part of the first meeting. I was It's like the political parties nominate different scholars or experts who they want to talk about that, and I have to admit that it is everything else but an expert committee really discussing issues of constitutional affairs, but it's very much a politicized atmosphere of just either strengthening the opposition or the political parties in power. So, and what was really important, in my view, were then the two meetings. One of the National Parliament, which is the most important part of the Parliament, and the other second chamber of the Parliament, the Federal Council. And then in March it was signed. Because what I want to give you now also is, at the end of my talk, to introduce you to some of the most interesting topoi that were used during this debate on how to defend or oppose this law of religion. Maybe to start with the first official press conference on the 2nd of October, one minister from the Social Democratic Party was saying that, and that was kind of on one side, one of the most contested issues for the public debate, and on the other side it was also one of the contents that was most important, it seemed, to the government parties, which is that he said, quote, "Rights and duties will be newly defined. This will be based on the principle that constitutional law is above religious law," quote end. This actually is part of the Austrian constitution, so it's nothing like very new, although you don't have this notion of religious law, because, I mean, everybody could ask, what is religious law? You can find an answer if you go to the Catholic Church, because they have a law, but in terms of Muslims, I would argue, especially the Islamic Council, there is no such thing as a law, a religious law, which is codified, which can be read. There are different traditions, it's a very heterogeneous group, and you don't have anything written down by this kind of council. And this, I think, also on the other side shows very much like these ideas of there is something that Muslims are loyal to the Sharia, and do not really care about the constitution is something which has to be thought about at the backdrop of all these kind of discourses. So what was criticized here was very much that it is a general suspicion towards the Muslim people, because the interesting thing is that although it is part of the constitution, you don't find any other law of religion where such a thing is mentioned. So then the question of the Muslim community and those who criticized it was why you just want to put it in the Islam law and not in any other law of religion. And the answer was actually that there is such a great mistrust. That was an answer by the parliament, by some of the parliamentarians. There is such a great mistrust against Muslims that if we take it out, because it was standing in the 1912 law, then you would just support those far-right politicians who always say, we are going to Islamize our country. So, another very important aspect by the Minister of Integration, he and the other minister just mentioned were like the two most important actors in the whole public debate, was that he wanted to have an official translation of the Quran as an attachment to the Islam law. This was still in the first draft, and it was taken out of the law actually, to strengthen transparency of Islamic denominations and have an authorized version of the Quran in the face of the IS or ISIL. So because their argument was, if ISIL comes and argues that this is the jihad we want to have, you can come with the officially recognized Quran of the Austrian government to say, oh no, this is not the Quran. Okay? I mean, I think we don't have to dig more into this issue about the logic of this kind of argument, but this was constantly brought up in the public debate. And it's also very interesting that if we go back looking at October 2014, one of the most prevalent aspects of public debate was actually the ISIL issue. So it happened, although MPs were regularly, MPs from the governmental parties were regularly saying this is no answer to the ISIL issue. There was one incident when Reinhard Lopatka, who is actually the head of the club of the Conservative Party in National Parliament, said it is the respective answer to Islamism in a parliamentary debate on ISIL. So you see very much that some of the MPs really understood it like that. And it was especially important, I think, the fact that the whole debate about this law occurred in a time of when the world was speaking about ISIL and radical jihadis traveling from Austria to Syria and Iraq, that this also weakened very much the position of the Islamic Council itself. So the climate was very, very bad for them to push any of other demands through that which they thought would be in respect to anti-discrimination and the Austrian constitution. So some of the major criticism against the law was that it was a law against and not for and with the religious society or the Muslim community. Another aspect was that what we already talked about, this issue of state law is above religious law. And the third aspect, which was also very prominent in the public debate, is that no foreign funding for Muslim organizations is allowed anymore. This was especially interesting because, you may know that one of the strongest countries which is against the access of Turkey into the European Union is actually Austria, because of our history of frontier Orientalism. And the Turkish community is, let's say, that the strongest in quantity, but also they are the ones who have most of the Muslim organizations in Austria. So a part of these organizations is actually getting its imams, its clerics, paid by the Turkish government in Austria. So the argument being generally all of the Austrian society being very anti-Turkish, the main argument here was that we want to have our own Austrian imams who do not speak Turkish but who speak German. I will come to that topos or the German language later, because it's a very, very central one in the very racist discourse we have, which links language to color of skin, race, and let's say also to some extent Christian religion. So the last point is that the law at the end of the day in fact really strengthens very much the already existing Muslim organizations, the larger ones, and weakens the very heterogeneous Muslim community, because what the law says is there in the future there is no more Muslim organization legally recognized by the law of associations. In Austria, if me and Jack wants to create any kind of association, we just go to the Ministry of Interior. Within 5 weeks we're going to have an association. It's very, very easy. The law of association gives you really lots of space to create whatever kind of association you want. So for the future, what the Islam law says is there is no associations according to the law of association, which actually means that Muslims don't have any possibility in the future based on their religion to create any kind of association, but only to have an association which is part of the legally recognized Islamic Council. The idea behind that is that in the future nobody can come and speak for Islam, only the Islamic Council. On the other side, I mean, that was also my point of criticism here, is like what you will do then is actually you will create an underground Islamic movement which is not publicly visible anymore, and then the possibility of them also, because they feel alienated, to say, okay, we're going to have a more radical stance towards state institutions will be very easy. So this aspect was not really, I mean, it did not really get through in all of the public debate. But I think it's very, very important to say that, because what we see all over Europe is this kind of securitization of the Islam topic. So it's like very much this ministries of security who are interested in creating these state Islams. Look at Germany, the Islam Conference, or also the establishment in France of the Conseil d'Organisation Islamique in Paris, where the major Muslim organizations are part of. All of this shows us that it is very much an interest, especially of the ministries of interior, who want to have this kind of control. And so some of the critics were also speaking of the surveillance, the possibility of surveilling Muslim people. Because as a matter of fact, I mean, this is nothing public, but at least like when I spoke to those people who are now drafting the new internal constitution for the Islamic Council, they were saying that the government wants them to publish all the names who are registered in the Islamic Council. Well, the head of this Jewish community in 2010, when there was a similar issue, he was saying that, well, we remind ourselves what happened with all those names that were registered 80 years ago during the Nazi rule, so we won't give any name to anybody. But it's interesting to see that you have a very similar idea of knowing who is doing what in those from this Muslim activist movements, who are all part of the Islamic Council. So I will now just give you a short quote of, I think, a very, very much revealing episode of a debate between the far-right leader and the Minister of Interior of the Conservatives, which shows us very much the spirit of how the debate was in the public sphere. Strache, who is the leader of the far-right, says, concerning the Islam law, there are positive rudiments like the ban of foreign funding that prevents foreign states to take influence in our politics, but this also needs possibilities of control and sanctions. Until now, I missed the possibility to lose the status of corporate public body and withdrawal of legal status, which is actually one of the demands that they published first time in 2008. The Minister of Interior, Kurz, says, Mr. Strache, it seems you haven't read the law draft. And he goes on, the law contains fines and the possibility for the Chancellor, who is like the President here, to dissolve a denomination or a religious society. And Strache goes on, that's too little. Other problems in the law are that preachers and lectures have to be in German. Also the Quran has to be translated into German. And Kurz argues, also the translation of the Quran is in the law. I want to point out 4 aspects. First of all, the law entails the precedence of the Austrian legal system before belief. Secondly, the declaration of belief, which means the Quran, is part of the law. Thirdly, German as language of education is self-evident. And fourth, I was the first politician who urged that mosques should preach in German. And Strache argues, Mr. Kurz, I demanded this before you even were into politics. Kurz is the youngest foreign and integration minister around the globe currently. So I think it's very revealing because it very much shows that many of the demands of the far right were actually, at least on a discursive level, implemented and adopted by the former centrist parties. What I have to mention here again is that there is definitely a difference between what the law really says and what is talked about the law. So not really everything which is mentioned here in this interview is really implemented. And it is also a question, I think it's still too early to say because the law was just published in March this year, too early to say what will really happen. In many ways, the law is very open to different kinds of interpretation. So you can read a very, very bad situation in it, but you can also, from a liberal perspective, can argue many other articles away. So it really depends on who is in power. But nevertheless, I think we always have to keep in mind, currently, the far-right political party in Austria is the strongest in regards to polls. It's more than 35% they have if national elections would take place in these days. So I will just list and give a short overview of how the law was debated in Parliament. There is some of the top ways that were used to support the law by the government coalition was that by this law radical Islam or Islamism could be worked again. So to give you a few quotes, one of the Social Democratic MPs says, we have to, quote, intervene in associations who give hate preachers some space, quote, end. So by being able to control this one institution, surveil them, we can see who's the radical and who is not. And as Lopatka says, quote, we will do everything to act against radicals. We will do everything, quote, end. I already mentioned the topics of the stilling of fears. Lopatka again argues that, quote, we have to still the fears of the people. We want to suppress the influence of the radicals, and this is done by the Islam law, quote, end. The topic of the precedence of law is one of the MPs from the ruling party says, quote, if we would not have hold on it, this may have increased the fear of people, this general suspicion issue. Why? Because there are people on the road who fan fear. They would have used this as an opportunity and have said, now the precedence of state law is no more in the law. Islam has asserted himself. Some may have even said, Sharia now is on the foreground. Another very important aspect is the issue of belonging. There is a long history of this coming from Germany. The question of which chancellor would make it possible to say Islam is part of Germany. And this debate also came after a while to Austria. And here there is a very clear stance from the far right opposition. Strache says, quote, "I say no. Islam does not belong to Austria, neither culturally nor historically," quote end. So the ruling parties see it in the contrast. Minister Kurz says, "In my opinion, Islam belongs to Austria. We have recognized Islam as the first country in Austria, in Europe in 1912. We have to be cautious not to deny realities. It does not help us to act as if there was no Islam in Austria, although we have 500,000 Muslims," quote end, which, by the way, makes 6% of the whole population. So, again, interesting is that even within the ruling parties, different MPs have very different stances towards the issue. Like, you even see some social democrats who would disagree with that and see the Islam law more as a possibility to create more order, to have control over the Muslims, but deny also that Islam has anything to do with or is part of Austria, very much explainable by saying that social democratic parliamentarians generally have a problem with religion, and therefore would argue that, well, there is actually no religion part of our Austrian society, but we have to diminish the influence of religion in public space. Concerning the topics of German language, I think this is a very, very central aspect in the whole debate, because the law says that you will have an establishment of an Islamic theology faculty at the University of Vienna, but what was said in the discourse was that we will have German imams being trained in Austria, which is actually not the fact, but that was what was the argument in the public space. And Strache argues here, the far-right leader, quote, "Public authorities have to be able to understand what is being preached in the mosque," quote end. And this very much reminds us of the anti-Semitic discourse which we had like 110 years ago when it all started in Vienna, that all of the very anti-Semitic ruling parties wanted to know what is being taught in the synagogue, what is being taught in the books or the Talmud, and they all wanted to have it translated, they all wanted to have them speak German, and so on and so forth. So it's very, very similar aspects. And also this example which I gave you before, this Vienna should not become Istanbul, actually the first mayor of one of the mayors, long-time mayors of Vienna, of which Adolf Hitler was saying he was my trainer in terms of anti-Semitism, Karl Lueger, at that time was saying Vienna should not become Jerusalem. Okay, speaking about the 200,000 Jews who were living in Vienna back in the days of then 2 million population, or the city of the Habsburg monarchy. Another aspect was what they called the Austrian imprint of Islam, which is kind of a way of Europeanize and Austrianize Islam and make it, as one MP from the Social Democratic Party says it, make the interpretation, quote, make the interpretation of the Quran one which is in sympathy with European values and European enlightenment, quote end. So for them it is, the Islam law is in fact a tool to bring Islam in a way, make it construct actually a new Islam that is not in a contradiction, does not stand in contradiction to national constitution and whatever is this kind of values of Europe. Another aspect was the foreign funding. We already talked about the topics of order, where they wanted to have this transparency. One MP says, we want this order and this transparency in order that no contents are spread in any single mosque which are the contents of the Islamic State, quote end. And it's really interesting that even from the Green Party, which is a very anti-racist and more of the leftist camp, even MPs from them argued that the reason why we do not support the Islam laws is because there is too less control. For instance, what I mentioned at the very beginning, if you have public religious education in public schools, he said, we want to have also in the law the control of this religious education in the public school. And there is one reason why this was not put into the law, because if you put anything which has to do with law of school into another law, you need more than 66%, 2/3 of the parliamentarians voting for it, and this would for sure had not been possible. And there is only one Green MP actually who criticizes and calls the Islam law a police security law, quote end. And there is very interesting that the ministers who are in charge of the law actually defended the kind of discourse that was also prevalent in the national parliament debate as being very much against the principles of the Austrian constitution. To quote Minister Ostermeier, he says, "It is not the job of the Cultural Affairs Office to be a police of religion. A police of religion only exists in absolutist dictatorships, in dictatorial states," quote end. And it's funny to see that this was actually the whole criticism of also the civil society, arguing that this is not worth for a democratic political system, but it resembles a dictator and authoritarian kind of political system. And it's very funny that he is the one who says, well, that's not our business, but I would say if you have a far-right government, it may be being implemented very soon. Concerning the topics of unrepresentativity, the government parties were mainly arguing, saying that the law was negotiated with the Islamic Council, which is the legally recognized body for the Muslims, so it is very legitimate. While the opposition was saying that, well, the Islamic Council is representing organized political Islam, Muslim Brotherhood, Milli Görüş, and other Muslim movements, and by that not being able to really speak for the whole of the Muslim community. Well, we already spoke about the general suspicion. There was also, from the opposition, the topics of unequal treatment, that Muslims are discriminated against, and there was, last but not least, the topics of Austria being a model for all of Europe by implementing this law. So this is I think I tried to give you an overview of how this law was debated. Again, the question of how it will be implemented is still in the future. So we will see what happens, especially on 1st March in 2016. The aspect of the dissolution of Muslim associations according to the law of association has to be implemented, and then the process of including them into this one institution, or the Islamic Council, should proceed, and then we will really see how the political system and the people in charge of that will deal with this issue. Until now, I think there have been 2 trials, 2 Muslim organizations who have gone to the Constitutional Court to make a plea against it, and we will also see maybe in December or later how this will go. So thank you for listening to me and for the attention you gave me, and hope to have a nice discussion with you. Thank you.